Metaphor ReFantazio is shaping up to be 2024's most anticipated JRPG, and unlike Shin Megami Tensei and Persona, Metaphor will be starting anew as Atlus's third pillar. There's a good chance that Metaphor will be many players' first Atlus game, so we've compiled a few tips and tricks that will help you on your journey to becoming a worthy king of Uchronia. But before we start, thank you to ATLUS and SEGA for letting us play the full game early. We played on the hardest difficulty, and these tips will cover the general gameplay loop from story to combat and to daily life. So let's talk about it. Perhaps one of the biggest issues for me was resource management. The majority of skills you use in combat require something called MP, and you may find yourself running out of MP in the middle of a dungeon that you can't retreat from because, it's the deadline. Yeah, I waited for the last day. In this particular dungeon, there were only 3 to 4 potions that restore MP, and no store to buy items from. There are various rest spots that act like checkpoints, but they only allow you to save, talk to companions, or teleport to other rest spots, and it does not replenish HP and MP. You can avoid this situation by reading what your archetypes do, which is like a class/demon/persona that your characters can take up. Specifically, the mage archetype has this very small passive where enemies that are stunned or defeated on the field will grant a whopping 1 MP to your entire party. So a bit of backtracking and grinding is necessary in order to replenish your MP, or you can avoid wasting all your MP on every single enemy you see. Eventually, you do unlock an archetype that steals MP though, so it's also a good idea to diversify your archetypes and try out everything there is to see. I personally relied on the brawler archetype, who deals massive physical damage by sacrificing HP. It was a bit risky, but it was much easier to replenish and let me save up more MP. Now, veterans of Atlus titles might be more prepared for this though, so it might just be me. But hey, that's what these tips are for. While you backtrack, you'll be on the field a lot, so here are some field combat tips. Locking onto enemies is very helpful, not only in moving the camera and aiming your attacks, but attacking from far while locked on will make you dash towards that enemy, which is a really nice tool for closing the gap. You'll also have to avoid enemy attacks or you'll get ambushed. Luckily, the timing window for dodging is pretty generous. Even if you're in the middle of your attack and the enemy does an attack, there is a white flash, an audible sound cue, and even a slight pause for you to dodge. So pay attention to avoid getting ambushed, or you'll end up giving the enemy the first turn, which can be pretty fatal. While we're on the topic of combat, one of the key mechanics of Metaphor is the transition from action to turn-based combat, where if you attack an enemy enough times, a stun bar will deplete and allow you to enter squad battle, which is the turn-based combat, and it will give you a huge advantage, where your characters will get the first turn, deal damage to all enemies, as well as stunning them, which causes the enemies to pass their turn to you again. Thing is, the damage from the preemptive attack only brings the enemy down to around 70% health, though it could be more on easier difficulties. A strategy I found is to avoid entering squad battle by ignoring the button prompt. You can dodge to cancel it faster as well. This allows you to deal more damage on the field instead, so when you do enter squad battle, the enemy will have even less health, which allows you to save up on more resources. Additionally, the continuous stunning will also activate Mage's passive and restore more MP as mentioned earlier. Something you have to look out for is the way that the game pulls in enemies from the field to squad battle. There could be only one enemy on the field, but they tend to call reinforcements in the squad battle, which means you'll be fighting more enemies than you expected. If you're really pressed for resources, it might be a smarter choice to just escape, or you'll end up using more resources for a battle you didn't expect. Or again, like mentioned in the previous tip, you can avoid squad battle altogether to save up on resources. Let's say you do engage in squad battle, the explanation of turns may be a bit confusing for newcomers. There are 2 types of turns in this game, denoted by the size of the turn crystal, which is similar to something called press turn in older Atlus games. The full-size crystal indicates 1 turn, but it can be passed to other allies. Passing causes it to turn into a half-sized crystal. A half-sized crystal is also 1 turn, but it cannot be passed to other allies, and it must be used by the current character. These turn crystal things also applies to the enemy as well, and they are very important to maximizing your combat capabilities. That's because some of your character's most powerful skills come in the form of something called synthesis skills, which is a combination of 2 archetypes skills. You can read which archetype is needed in a party to access these specific skills. Most of the time, synthesis skills are very powerful and start to be your first AoE skills, but with the added cost of multiple turns, regardless of half or full. As mentioned earlier, characters can pass their turn too, so it's a good idea to plan out whose synthesis skills you want to use, and then pass the turn accordingly to have the right number of turn crystals on the right character. There are a number of things to look out for if you really want to maximize your combat abilities and avoid getting destroyed. Metaphor relies heavily on exploiting weaknesses. Every enemy, including your own characters, have their own weaknesses, and they play like a rock-paper-scissors game. The most common ones are the attack types like strike, pierce, and slash, along with the various elements. Striking a weakness will only use up half of the turn crystal, so it's like reducing the cost of that turn by half, though it must be used by the current character. For synthesis skills that use 2 turn crystals, striking a weakness will half its cost, meaning you have 2 half-turn crystals remaining, which is literally 2 extra turns, and you can imagine that's quite powerful. Despite the emphasis on weaknesses, you won't really know an enemy's weakness until you try an attack. A strategy we found is to make use of the quick retry feature that quickly resets the battle to the first turn, and it allows you to test out various attacks to check out their weaknesses and then retry for the most optimal battle, because the info about weaknesses will be saved. Striking a critical will grant the attacker an extra turn, but the half-size turn crystal, which means you have to use it on the current character. Meanwhile, striking a resist will cause the target to receive less damage overall. Striking a repel will cause the target to take 0 damage and reflect the damage back to the attacker. And even worse, the attacker will relinquish all their turns to the enemy, which is pretty dangerous. Missing an attack will miss, and even worse, the attacker will lose 2 turns as well, regardless of a full or half crystal turn. You will inevitably encounter all of these effects, and it's a good idea to pay attention to them, as they can be very useful but also very detrimental, because the enemy can take advantage of all of these effects as well. So overall, we think that this is quite a balanced and strategic combat system that combines the best of both worlds from Shin Megami Tensei and Persona, while still being unique on its own. Another thing to look out for is the formation system. Your party has a front and back row, where allies in the front row will deal more melee damage but also have lower defense. The opposite is true for the back row, where allies take less melee damage but also deal less melee damage. The formation doesn't seem to have an effect on magic attacks though, so putting your magic focus archetypes in the back row can greatly increase their survivability. Some enemies will have dedicated attacks to the front or back row, which is shown by a prompt in advance, and most of the time, these attacks are basically a guaranteed one-shot. At least that's the case on the hardest difficulty. So pay attention to attacks, and change up your allies' formation accordingly to fully maximize the damage and defense of formations. As mentioned briefly earlier, rest spots are available across dungeons as a checkpoint. Occasionally, there will also be a cat that acts like a rest spot. These are the only points you can make a save in dungeons, aside from the entrance, so watch out because save spots are rather scarce in dungeons. Outside of dungeons though, you can save in cities or any safe place. When you're outside of dungeons, you'll be going through the daily life section of Metaphor, which is a staple of many ATLUS titles. One thing that's also consistent is the fact that you'll probably be broke and have no money. Unlike Persona, where you can get a job, you'll have to work hard for this money, which is mainly earned by doing side quests or a lot of combat. But you should hold on to your money for a specific day called Idol's Day. You see, shop items are pretty damn expensive, but every Idol's Day, which is like Sunday I think, every single shop will have a massive discount, which is around 20%. Aside from that, you can also convert money. You have this secondary currency called mag, which is used for unlocking archetypes. But there comes a time where you don't really have a use for mag, so there's an NPC that allows you to convert all your excess mag into money. But just like Idol's Day, you should hold off converting mag because there are days where the weather is bad, like for example rain, and the exchange rate for mag to money will be increased, which is way more valuable. Now I am legally obliged to say that this is not financial advice for the real world, but jokes aside, these specific events should help you save money and avoid going broke like your average Persona protagonist. Further down the game, weather starts to play a bigger role too. Aside from the different scenery and mag exchange rate, bad weather will start to influence your combat effectiveness. Enemies will become tougher, and your whole turn bonus on exploiting weaknesses just gets thrown out of the window. At the very least, you will earn more XP during bad weather, so it is an option to grind more enemies during these days. As your daily life continues, there are various activities you can do in towns or during downtime in the story. These activities involve you learning about companions, certain NPCs, doing a side quest, or just regular old chores. Your character has various traits and stats called royal virtues that determine which quests you can do, and activities are what increases these stats. If you've played any ATLUS game with the social sim, you'll feel right at home with this gameplay loop. Activities will use up a set amount of time though, and the game will progress accordingly, so make sure you plan out what to do, whether that be increasing your stats, bonding with companions, or traveling to dungeons. You can at most do 2 activities in one day, so being a completionist to see it all will be much tougher, though this is kind of the norm in Atlus games. It makes everything you do feel more special and have more thought behind them. And well, that roughly concludes the entire gameplay loop of Metaphor ReFantazio, and to an extent, the general formula of Atlus games, from progressing the story, to daily life, to dungeon crawling, and back to the story. But before we end the video, let's have a quick chat about Metaphor. So it is inevitable that Metaphor ReFantazio is being compared heavily to Atlus's long-standing IPs like Persona and Shin Megami Tensei, but the developers have insisted that Metaphor will be able to stand by itself as a third pillar among Atlus titles. So is Metaphor just a fantasy Persona, or is there something more that sets itself apart? Well, aside from the gameplay aspects that we just talked about, we can't deny it's very familiar with other Atlus titles, though it's definitely inheriting the best that Atlus has to offer. Where Metaphor can truly stand out is in its unique setting and story, which has taken a more fantasy route while combining medieval, steampunk, and urban designs. Unlike the high school life in Persona, Metaphor's story has a much more serious tone. The story doesn't shy away from sensitive topics like racism, politics, discrimination, poverty, class, and corruption. The entire game is presented in this beautiful art style that I can't really describe. It's like a mix of colors and textures that makes everything look like a painting, like an artist's interpretation of a fantasy world, which is quite interesting because the protagonist has this book that describes a fantasy world which is much different from theirs, but actually it describes our real life world. I mean, besides, the massive monsters that we fight are literally called humans, though they don't look like humans. So, a bit of speculation here, but there's a good chance that the story will dive into this parallel world kind of thing. There are plenty of animated cutscenes, including 3D ones. The music also takes on a more orchestral and religious route. Compared to the jazz you see in Persona or the electronic music in Shin Megami Tensei. The most notable difference gameplay-wise is definitely the hybrid of action and turn-based combat, where other Atlus titles are known for their turn-based combat instead. It draws a lot of inspiration from Shin Megami Tensei with its press turn mechanic and demons, and Persona in the form of archetypes. Overall, the combination of both games and the new addition of action combat makes Metaphor's combat stand out among the already established titles. But the biggest personal impact for me was the sense of journey through the world, especially when the party unlocked their mobile base called the Gauntlet Runner. Something about setting off on a multi-day long journey to various cities with you and your companions, it just felt very homey or relatable and humbling. In conclusion, Metaphor ReFantazio definitely inherits that Atlus DNA for its gameplay loop and mechanics from Shin Megami Tensei, Persona, and even some older titles. That said, the formula Atlus has created is loved by many, and the popularity of their games among fans is a testament to that. So inheriting this tried and true formula is certainly a positive, though where Metaphor can truly set itself apart is in its setting, characters, and new story direction. But for that, we'll just have to wait and see where Metaphor will take us. Anyway, we hope these tips and tricks helped you a little, especially if you're new to Atlus's formula. If you have any tips, whether from Metaphor or other Atlus titles, feel free to share it with everyone below. And with that said, make sure you subscribe for more future videos just like this one.